guys, happy again to be talking with you. Welcome to another series, another module in the series. This time around, this module will focus on Brown laws. Brown laws is the third among the modules that focus on laws that protect the environment. Okay, it is also the third in the series of 4 modules, so it's the penultimate module. It's the second to the last module. Okay. Now, as I said, Brown laws focus also on protection of the environment, but it differs significantly to that of the other laws that we covered, the other modules. Let me explain. Green laws, for example, the protection that it focused on was on flora, fauna, as well as wildlife and land ecosystems. Blue laws also had a similar protection or protection focus. The aim of blue laws is to protect coastal and marine wildlife as well as their ecosystems and resources. Brown laws, on the other hand, focuses entirely on pollution control. Okay, pollution control. Okay, as well the regulation of specific activities that could affect the environment. Okay, the laws and rules under Brown laws include those that aim at about 4 specific areas. The first one is in controlling toxic substances and hazardous wastes. The second is on effective management of solid waste. The third is on policing air and water quality. And the fourth is providing means to assess environmental impact. So these 4 areas are actually what comprises the entire collection of laws under Brown laws. However, in this special certificate program, there are only 2 that are covered. So those are the 2 that we will focus our attention to today. Okay, and these 2 are the one that focuses on policing air and water quality, and then the second is on managing solid waste. I have broken these 2 into their own lessons, so you have lesson 1 and 2. Lesson 1 on policing air and water quality is going to focus, or at least it'll give attention to, or it'll reference 2 laws. The first one is the Clean Air Act, and then the second is the Clean Water Act. For lesson 2 on managing solid waste, there will be 1 law which focuses specifically on that subject matter. Okay, so having said that, having given you an introduction of what's going to be happening, what our focus will be, I think at this point we're about ready to get started. So why don't we go ahead and begin to look at lesson number 1. The first law is the Philippine Clean Air Act of 1999, otherwise referred to as Republic Act number 8749. And the second one is the Philippine Clean Water Act of 2004, Republic Act number 9275. Okay. Now, for these 2 laws, we're going to be answering the same 3 questions that we were asking the other laws that we've since covered thus far. Okay. So we'll start with the Clean Air Act, and we'll ask the first question: what is this law about? And we have our answer. Fundamentally, this law, Clean Air Act of 1999, is about controlling air pollution. Controlling air pollution. The title, in fact, or the law, in giving it a descriptive title, even says that it is an act that provides for a comprehensive policy on controlling air pollution. In other words, comprehensive air pollution control policy. Okay. Now, because this is a little different. These Brown laws are a little different. in their focus. They're focusing not on a specific, not necessarily on a specific resource, but the need to control the pollution in those resources. Unlike the other laws, you might recall, like in green laws, it was about protecting flora and fauna, including wildlife. And then the blue laws, the same thing. We're controlling some resource or protecting some resource. Here it's a little different, and because of that, I think medyo broad ito eh. When we say controlling air pollution, medyo may pagka-broad siya. It gives us a general idea of what the law is all about, but I think there might be need to dig just a little bit deeper to help us better understand what this law is all about. So why don't we do that? So we're going to look at what the law says about what this comprehensive air pollution control policy provides. Okay. First thing it says is that it shall pursue a policy of balancing development and environmental protection, and that it shall also pursue a framework based on sustainable development. Okay. I presented these two bullet points together because they really speak to the same thing, which is sustainable development. The first one, balancing development and environmental protection, is really a means to attain sustainable development. Okay, and it may seem a little different. It's phrased a little different, but when we say balancing development and environmental protection, this is no different from what we've said earlier about the need to balance, the need to protect these valuable resources, and the ability to use them. Siyempre, if we use them, we want to control that so that we are not depleting these limited resources. Okay, so here it's just phrased it's the same thing, but it's phrased a little differently. It's talking about development, okay, as the utilization. But it's saying the same thing. And of course, this idea of balancing development and environmental protection really talks about, as I said earlier, attaining sustainable development. So let's talk a little bit about what sustainable development is. The United Nations, in actually one of the commissions there, who in fact even coined the phrase sustainable development, actually defined it. It said that development, or rather sustainable development, is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So medyo hindi nagkakalayo sa balancing, that statement about balancing utilization or development with protection of the limited resources, the environmental resources. So it's no different from that, right? The only thing that it really seems to say a little differently is yung purpose for the need to balance. Okay, and the purpose, of course, is so that the future generations, we're not compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Okay, so yan ang difference, but they're really talking about the same. So since in defining sustainable development, it says that it is development that meets the needs, blah, 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 blah. So let's talk about what it means by development. Well, in simple terms, if we just look up the dictionary, the development is really a process, diba? It's a process in which someone or something grows or changes and becomes more advanced. Okay. So that's what we're talking about here. When we say development, it's the same thing as utilization, but I think what makes it a little different is it speaks to the process that you're using, okay, that aims to enable growth or allows one or that something to become more advanced. I guess parang yung internet. The internet developed in the United States, commercialized some 20 plus years ago. Not everybody was connected to it, but in time, a lot of industries joined the bandwagon. So naturally, other countries needed to do the same. Not just countries, but other industries needed to do the same. And in order for them to participate, they would, have to naturally develop their infrastructure. Okay, and of course that involves, using perhaps limited resources, like additional electricity, additional equipment that uses whatever resource. So it's having to tap some resources in order for them to develop. Okay. Likewise, it speaks of the benefit that if they're able to do that, that they're able to grow and become more advanced, and naturally they'll be able to play into to that new medium. Okay, so that's kind of what we're talking about here. It's utilization, but the law used the word development because it's talking about something that is not just for the sake of using it, but to actually, enable growth, advance, and so forth. So now, since the resource that we're talking about here is not something that requires a conscious decision to use, okay, then it's kind of special, right? In a couple of ways. Number one, as I said, it does not require a conscious decision, so people just use it. Okay, people just use it. Every one of us, we breathe the air without having to decide if we're going to breathe it or not. We've started to use this resource ever since we were born, and the only time that we'll stop using it, of course, is when we die. All right. So we're using the resource, and our use of it, you can say, involves is really development, and that's probably why they're using the word development here. Say we breathe it every day. We exercise, we breathe it even more so. We work hard and we breathe it more so. And then when we go out to party, we kind of abuse it also. Not just when we breathe out carbon dioxide, but when we smoke cigarettes, when we use our cars, and our cars, since they use fossil fuel, they'll belch out carbon monoxide. So there's that, right? But all of those things are intended for our growth, for our personal growth, for our personal development. So I guess that's a good way to kind of exemplify why instead of utilization they're using development. Okay, so anyway, that's that. I hope this kind of makes sense, but let's move forward and see what else it says. Okay, it says also that the program, or at least the policy, should formulate. The policy says that there's need to formulate a national program. Okay, so the word national used here already speaks to the scope. Hindi lang sa Metro Manila, hindi lang a particular city, but the entire nation. Okay, so it speaks to that as its scope. The word holistic, in simple terms, is derived from the word holistic is derived from the word whole, W-H-O-L-E. Okay, so wo, that's why you'll see on the bottom left corner I use this circle as an example, and this circle is the way the United Nations is trying to demonstrate all of the aspects of their sustainable development goals. So you'll see it's like a salvavidas, it's like a wheel, all right? And on the outer layer, there's different things listed, and those things represent particular aspects of their sustainable development goal. And then there are others also in this inner green part of the wheel. So the whole thing represents, of course, their sustainable development goal. So same with what we're talking about here when we say holistic. It should be all-encompassing. It should be all-encompassing It's an all-encompassing national program aimed at managing and controlling air pollution. Okay, so that's really all it says. Now, in addition to this, it says that this holistic national program should focus on pollution prevention. Okay, and the easiest and quickest way to answer um, or to respond to that is we simply just refer to the cliche, right? The old cliche that says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which of course means that if we could prevent, pollution from happening, then we need not do a whole lot in controlling it. We don't have to control and do any kind of controlling or much controlling later on. I say we would have prevented what we would otherwise have to control later on. Okay. Now, this statement doesn't mean that all efforts in controlling it is going to stop and all those energies would be redirected to pollution prevention. That's not what this means. I don't think so anyway. It means that yun ang tututukan, that would be the focus, is pollution prevention, while continuing to do whatever is necessary in controlling air pollution. And I say this because if you look at the law, yung sentence that discusses this really says something to the effect that the focus should be on pollution prevention in place of control. Parang ganyan. So it almost sounds like don't control, but do this instead. Parang ganyan. Okay? But that's not what it means. It just means that our primary focus should be in prevention, but controlling pollution should still be part of the effort. Next, implemented through proper delegation and effective coordination. We're still, at this point, we're still talking about the holistic national program. So it's this means of implementing it continues to refer to the holistic national program. I think to better explain what this is, let's first talk about who is mandated to be the lead agency on this matter. It's actually the DENR, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, through their line bureau, the EMB, the Environment Management Bureau. Okay, and they are imbued with the authority and the functions to do these things, to implement what's on this law. Okay, there may be cases where there is a need to tap as a multiple or a force multiplier. There may be a need to tap as a force multiplier a government agency or an instrumentality of the government for some of this function. And since the DENR is the one that is mandated and thus imbued with the authority to conduct those functions, in order for them to delegate, it would have to be done properly. And the proper delegation employed today is through deputation, meaning they deputize the respective agency or instrumentality such that they would be given the authority to essentially do those functions. Okay, so the proper delegation that is being referred to here, actually the being able to deputize the agency, that deputization process is what this proper delegation is really referring to. It's delegation, but it's made proper because it's the formal process of delegating that responsibility to that agency. Okay. Now there may be cases where an agency already has functions that are inherently theirs, so they don't need to actually be delegated that function from the DENR. All that is necessary would essentially be to coordinate between that agency and DENR so that they could be in harmony towards attaining their same intended goals, okay, of controlling air pollution. So that's what that bullet point is, implemented through proper delegation and effective coordination. Next is, okay, this bullet point. Let's talk about industries first. I think we have at this point an idea that many industries are the culprit to air pollution. Readily evident. In fact, this slide that you're looking at right now, the background is that of a kind of a manufacturing plant, and there's actual bottom pipes that are pointing up to the sky, and those pipes are outlets for smoke. You know, the parang byproduct of whatever this company is manufacturing. So yung mga sinusunog nila, you know, it basically creates smoke that goes out through these pipes. Okay, so yung mga industries na ganyan, you know, industries that cause this pollution, and there's quite a good number of those that do that. Okay, there's a need for them to cooperate. Okay, and not just them. As we said earlier, each one of us, you know, are, you know, using this resource, you know, without having to consciously decide if we're going to use it or not. Okay, we're using this resource, and we are also contributing to the air pollution. Okay, so much the same that industries need to cooperate, there's also a need for every citizen to cooperate. And again, as consumers of this resource, we never had any kind of training on its use, and naturally there's also correspondingly no training on how to prevent pollution. We just by nature use and pollute without really knowing sometimes what we're doing. So if there's a need for cooperation, but not limited to cooperation, there is need for self-regulation. You know, we need to police ourselves. Okay, we need to have some conscious effort of contributing to the need to control air pollution. So that's what this is all about. Last on this list is promote public information and education in air quality planning and monitoring. So this really speaks to what I just described moments ago as to our lack of understanding sometimes of the use and misuse of this resource. Okay, again, we were born not having to be taught how to use it, so it's also not common for us to be trained on how not to abuse it or how not to pollute the air. Okay, so there is that need, okay, to be informed and be educated. And actually, this is not a completely new concept. I think in the last several years, maybe in the last 10 years or so, there's been some consciousness about pollution, probably more than 10 years. I'd say maybe about 20, possibly even 30 years. You know, there's already a public consciousness about pollution. So, you know, we've as a people have been informed and educated such that the generation today is much more conscious. Lalo na yung mga millennials, they're more environmental conscious. They recycle, things like that. So, and those are all byproducts of public information and education. Okay, so this bullet point just talks about the continuing need to do that. Because this is this is an ongoing thing. It's things change, so there may be needs about informing. There may be a need to inform people about what those changes are, things like that. So this is an ongoing activity as part of this comprehensive air pollution control policy. Okay. So as a policy, this Clean Air Act of 1999 describes the requirements for a comprehensive air quality / pollution management and control, and organizes these requirements into 3 areas. Okay, And the first area is air quality management system, followed by specification setting, or really it's a standard setting process, okay, that involves setting specifications. And then the third one is institutional mechanism. So we're going to talk briefly about each one of them. Let's start with the first one, air quality management system. Okay, in air quality management system, this system is actually centered, okay, or at least it's at the core of this system is this air quality action plan that we're going to talk about in a minute, okay? This air quality action plan actually is a byproduct, an output, if you will, of the efforts in a framework that's created specifically for the purpose. That framework is what they refer to as the Integrated Air Quality Improvement Framework. Okay, um, and that framework is something that just doesn't happen either. It's based on something else, and this something else is a status report that's done uh, at the national level. So it encompasses the entire country. Okay, it's a national air quality status report conducted by the DENR every year. So those outputs are the basis for the creation, which, and of course, this was this framework already exists. But the law at the time that it was created was talking about the creation of a framework, but and that's based on these reports. So anyway, this framework there is one now that was in essence responsible for the latest air quality action plan. What I have on the screen is a picture of a draft. I think there's one that's been no longer a draft. There's an actual formal one that was published sometime in 2017, 2018 timeframe. So anyway, this air quality action plan is what came out of the integrated air quality improvement framework, which of course was based on national air quality status reports that are done annually by DENR. Okay, so that's just how it kind of evolved. But let's now focus in on exactly what, in a summary, exactly what this air quality action plan is. Okay, bottom line is ano siya, blueprint siya. It's really a blueprint. Okay, it's really just a blueprint, an official blueprint that all government agencies must comply with. Okay, specifically so they can attain and maintain clean and healthy air. So any government entity that has some responsibility in compliance as well as being able to attain these conditions, these air quality conditions, okay, are supposed to follow or use this as a baseline for their efforts. Okay, so there's a number of things that it does, and I'm just going to identify a few just to kind of give you an idea of what's in this action plan. It provides for limitations on emissions. Okay, so as I'm sure you know, emissions, yan yung ini-emit, nilalabas, binubuga, kumbaga, right? Technically, all of us humans also emit. Every time that we breathe out, we're breathing out carbon dioxide, so we're kind of emitting that, right? But this doesn't apply to that. It really applies to, for example, industries or mechanisms or machines, not mechanisms, but machines, engines, or anything that produces, or emits, something that is a pollutant, namely carbon. Okay, so this action plan creates those limits and provides for their enforcement. Okay, and so the enforcement that it provides is actually based on provisions that prohibit adequate provisions that provide the prohibitions on pretty much prohibiting particular sources of these emissions, as well as types of emission activities. Okay, so it's not limited to the sources, to a particular source, but even on the types of emission activities. Okay. Now, the other thing that is included in this enforceable emission limitation, at least in these provisions, are other control measures, means or techniques, including schedules and timetables for compliance. So in other words, when this action plan comes out or came out, and let's say, for example, there's something there that says you have to be doing this, okay, and there's an existing company that isn't doing this, okay, what is that company to do? Is it now required to stop its operations? No. What the action plan provides basically is it provides for some time for these entities to comply. So it creates a timetable, a realistic timetable, so that they're not having to stop their operations. Okay, so that's what we're talking about as to control measures. Okay, what else? Okay, well, we already actually talked about control measures, but this one is as it relates to how this action plan actually enables entities, organizations, and whatnot to be able to comply. Okay, so some of these enabling things that it provides are incentives, right? Incentives, that would empower, for example, an organization to move faster, so they can meet those requirements. Maybe tax incentives or whatever, whatever it would take. And of course, these incentives have to be cost effective. And what that means is whatever cost the government would incur in offering those incentives, okay, the results should be commensurate with that. We're trying to get these guys to comply with their emission limits. Say they're polluting the air, so we want them to kind of stay within control, and we want them to comply. So if they do comply based on an incentive that's offered, whatever the cost is to the government in offering that incentive, then the result, the compliance by that organization, should be commensurate. It shouldn't cost more. The cost of the incentive shouldn't cost more. So really, that's what we're talking about when we say cost effective. Okay. So all right, what else? Okay, so syempre, there is mention of education and information. That's an integral part of the effort here. Okay. So another thing that we would find on this action plan is some discussion about designating airsheds. Okay. All right. So airsheds. What exactly are these? This could be a long discussion, so we'll just try to be brief about this. Airshed really are they're areas with a common characteristic. Essentially, they refer to areas that they have a common weather pattern, and the conditions there are pretty much the same, the meteorological conditions, and thus the sources of pollution are also pretty much the same. The sources could be from particular industries that are concentrated in that given area. So basically, all of that interchange or diffusion of pollution are all kind of consistent, in that area. And the easiest way to sort of make sense at a high level as to what we would find in this airshed is that basically they have similar qualities, as I sort of implied a minute ago. And being that that's the case, where there's this interchange of pollution that's common, they face the same or similar problems. And thus, the programs that would need to be developed for them, solutions, that sort of thing, would also be consistent. Okay, so that's, so they kind of are a big factor in efficiently coming up with a means to control air pollution in those given areas. Now, in the Philippines, there are 22 so far. Out of 20, as of 2018, there are I believe 22 designated airsheds. But that's not a static thing. Siyempre, the conditions on Earth change, and there's new areas that are being developed that may affect many of the conditions that could potentially create new airsheds. So the effort to designate airsheds is kind of an ongoing activity. So this action plan provides for the means. It sort of comes, suggests the rules, the criteria, that sort of thing, so that airsheds could be effectively designated. Okay, I hope that makes a little bit of sense. It's a kind of a long discussion, so we don't want to get too far into it, but I think, and I'm hoping anyway, that kind of at least gives you an idea of the importance of airsheds. Okay, so let's move forward. What else do we have here? Okay, the one thing I want to mention among the many provisions or many things that we find in an action plan is that if ever there's any case or instance where the action plan does not cover it, then there is this provision within that action plan that is to serve as a parang catch-all. So essentially anything that meets the criteria, and the criteria, of course, is that it's necessary for the effective control and abatement of air pollution. So if there's a thing that's not an activity or a measure that's not already on the action plan, but that activity or measure necessarily helps or is necessary for the effective control and abatement of air pollution, then it is essentially covered by this law already, because this provision kind of covers everything else that is not specifically covered. Okay, so I mean, the one reason why I put that in here is the idea kasi is that this needs to be comprehensive, diba? Kaya nga, it needs to be, it's a comprehensive policy, so naturally all of the requirements to ensure that everything in the policy is met, naturally it has to be all-encompassing then. So that's why they have this, as an example, this is a provision that if there's anything that's missed, in this action plan, that, it's covered, that it's allowed, so to speak, or that it is allowed in the action plan, thus allowed in the law. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So let's now move forward. I think at this point, we can shift gears and move to the second category of requirements on how this law provides, and that's in the area of specifications setting. And as I said earlier, this is more of a standard setting process. It's a process of setting standards from which rules or guidelines are to be based. Okay, so the idea here really is to put some controls over a number of things, namely fuels and additives. Okay, yun talaga yung focus nito, is on fuels and additives. Okay, and the goal is to be able to ensure that emission is reduced. And as we know, many of these additives, you see this picture up on the screen, they're different products that are supposed to improve the performance of your car, and so on and so forth. So they're things that are added to the fuel to essentially improve perhaps the performance of the vehicle. But there are consequences which, if not properly regulated, could actually cause more harmful emissions more than the benefit that you gain out of it. So there's a need to regulate that. There's a need to control that. There's a need to oversee and set standards that people would follow, so they're not, causing unnecessary pollutants in the air. Okay, so what we find in these provisions of law, of this law, is one that talks about, again, setting the specifications. And as I said, this is for fuels and fuel-related products, the additives. Okay, and we also find in these provisions, that it provides for allowable content of additives. It sets the limits on how much of this particular compound needs to be in there, that sort of thing. Okay, and just to kind of give us a good sense of how these two kind of are put into place, let me show you how the law provides for this. Okay, and this is actually the language in the law. Okay, essentially it is talking about unleaded premium gasoline, that in order for it to be allowed for commercial use, okay, it has to meet certain conditions. Okay, that it has to have an anti-knock index, or AKI, of not less than 87.5 and reed vapor pressure of not more than 9 psi. Okay, very technical. I mean, for us that are not, in this in the petroleum industry, I mean, those things may not make sense to us. But bottom line is, those are the limits, those are the specifications, those are the standards, right? That says in order for this type of gasoline, this unleaded premium gasoline, in order for it to be allowed for use, for manufacture, for import, for sales, supply, offer for sale, dispense, transport, or in any other way introduced into into commerce, okay, it must meet those conditions. It must meet that specification. Okay, so this is an example of what we're talking about as to setting expectations and even specifying the allowable contents of particular additives. Okay, so that's an example. Okay, what else might we find in this area, in this category within the law? Okay, it talks about regulating the use of any fuel or fuel additive. And okay, so when we say regulate in this context, and actually even in earlier laws it was in the same context, when regulate is used, when the word regulate is used, there is obviously need for permission, for licensing. Okay, so so that's what this is really talking about, right? Is essentially in order for particular additives and fuels to be, introduced into commerce, such fuel or additive has to be registered. Okay, hindi basta-bastang, porket it's already complying to the specifications, you could already introduce it into the marketplace. No, it has to be registered. So, and this applies to, manufacturers, processors, and traders. So, before they could, introduce what they've manufactured, before they can, introduce what they've processed or trade, okay, whatever it is that they're manufacturing, processing, or trading, okay, before that could be introduced into the marketplace, okay, it needs to be registered. Okay, that's what regulating here is referring to. And in the earlier laws that we covered, we were talking about permits and licenses. Okay, so here it's talking about registering. All right. Okay, now there's something I want to share just to kind of make sense of these regulating activities. It's not completely related to this thing that we're just talking about just now, but you can probably relate to this. This is I just want to show you a picture. This is something that, of course, we see here in the Philippines. The one on the right side, that's a commonplace kasi we live in Metro Manila, so we see a lot of those almost in every corner. Regular gas stations. This one is a picture of what looks to be like a Shell station. Siyempre, we could see that they're very. It's very likely that they're in compliance with all of what the law says they're supposed to be doing. Say you can see a number of things that indicate that, like there's nakapaskil, there's things that says, for example, the octane rating, okay, and then there's some signs that talk about what you can and cannot do while you're in the premises of the gas station. Of course, there's a price list, and not to mention, yung business permit nila nakapaskil sa pader, right? Very visible. So, those things kind of tell us that these guys are, legit, right? And as an investigator, it probably wouldn't draw any suspicion as to whether, these guys are conducting business involving fuel and fuel additives. It wouldn't seem like they would be doing anything unlawful. However, if you look on the left side, that's also commonplace. We see that a lot in the provinces. Diba, when in the rural areas we're driving. In fact, the first time I saw those, I thought they were selling some kind of juice kasi medyo red, diba? Gasolina pala yun. So, anyway, I just wanted to throw that out your way. And as an investigator, syempre, these are just pretty obvious things that would probably give you the right, what's the right word? The right kilite, if you will, or the right instincts to tell you that, siguro I need to focus more on the people on the left as a possible violator of this law. So anyway, so that's that. I just wanted to share that real quickly. All right, so let's move on. So the last point in this grouping refers to a prohibition on the manufacture, the importation, and sale of a type or a particular gasoline. As well, the prohibition on the engines and or components that would use that, okay, that use that type of gasoline. The gasoline I'm referring to here really is leaded gasoline. So the prohibition is in the manufacture, import, and sale of leaded gasoline. Just the same, the prohibition against manufacture, importation, and sale of engines and or components that actually require leaded gasoline. So that's where the prohibition is. Okay. Now there's a couple of important reminders come out of this discussion on leaded gasoline. First, I don't know if it's something that you remember or know about. If you're a millennial, you may not remember leaded gasoline. But anyway, it used to be, when you'd go to a gas station, unlike today, when you go to a gas station today, you have two general types of gasoline that is available for you, right? It's either unleaded or diesel, depending on the type of car or vehicle that you're using, right? And the only other options would be, if you're selecting unleaded, it's either the 91 or 95. And depending on the gasoline station you go to, they may refer to it. They may have different names for it, like premium, whatever, right? But anyway, in some years ago, at least up until I believe the year 2000, okay, it used to be leaded. There used to be a type of gasoline called leaded, the same one that we're talking about. And as the name implies, it had lead in it. Okay, unlike unleaded, there's no lead in it. And it was over time, I guess, it was discovered that lead, when it burns, because this is fossil fuel, so we're generating carbon monoxide, pollutants in the air. But particularly if the gasoline type was leaded, it was apparently worse for the environment. The effect was greater. So there was a need to eventually phase that out and prohibit it altogether. It couldn't be stopped dead on its tracks because cars were made so that they would use leaded gasoline, and of course many depended on it. There was industries, the petroleum industries, that a big bulk of their sales was on leaded. So, this clearly wasn't something that could just be prohibited. And, from that point forward of its effectivity of the prohibition, that everybody would just stop using it. It couldn't be done that way. It didn't make economic sense or any sense, period. Okay. So there was a need to phase that out. So this kind of goes back to our earlier discussion about timetables for compliance. This is actually a great example of that. In situations like that of leaded gasoline, it wasn't something that couldn't just be stopped right then and there and prohibit from that point forward. It had to be slowly, over time. It had to be phased out in such a way that it wouldn't have a dramatic impact on industries and whatnot that depended on this type of fuel. All right. So anyway, that's something I just wanted to add about that. But anyway, to this day, as I said, based on this last bullet point, you should not find any more leaded gasoline in circulation or available for sale. In fact, there probably wouldn't even be any engines anyway that would be able to effectively run on leaded gasoline. Okay, so that's that. On institutional mechanism, the law provides, first and foremost, that the lead agency for this law, or at least the agency that would be responsible for the implementation of this law, is the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, DENR. Okay. Interestingly, this law also specifically mandates that the agency or the bureau under the DENR, the bureau called Environmental Management Bureau, the law specifically converts it from a staff bureau into a line bureau. Okay, and although there's a period that there's duration for that designation as a line bureau, but the purpose, of course, is so that EMB, the Environmental Management Bureau, okay, the purpose is for that agency or that bureau of DNR to be empowered or to essentially be the agent, if you will, of DNR, serving as, of course, being the DNR as the lead agency. So the EMB, the Environmental Management Bureau, would be the bureau under DNR that would be responsible for implementing this law. Okay, so in addition to DNR, the law also provides that there is some linkages, some mechanism for linking up with other bodies, government bodies, and even non-government agencies, as well as people's organizations. Okay, so the law, the specific provision says that that the department, in this case DNR, through EMB, shall consult, participate, cooperate, and enter into agreement with other government agencies or with affected non-governmental or people's organizations, or even private enterprises in the furtherance of the objectives of this act. So again, DNR as the lead agency, through its line bureau EMB, they are to also link up with pertinent government, non-government agencies, as well as people's organizations, and even the private enterprise, in order to further the objectives of this law. Okay, so besides the two that I've already mentioned, there's also a definite need to involve the local government unit. And when we're talking about the local government unit, we're talking about the province, and the local executive there, of course, is the governor. We're talking about the city or municipality. In those two cases, the local executive there is the mayor, and quite possibly even the barangays. Okay, because that's what that's what is included in local government units. Okay, so the responsibility of local government units is that they are to share in managing and maintaining air quality within their territorial jurisdiction. Okay, and so they're having to follow the earlier framework that I mentioned, the integrated framework, and of course the action plan that came out of it. That's their, as I said earlier, it's their blueprint. So they're going to have to sort of follow that and implement accordingly, and specifically to their jurisdiction. Okay, so that means for the governor, it would be of course the province that he or she governs, and for the mayor of either the municipality or the city, it would obviously be the city or municipality, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the other point that needs to be made here is that the LGUs will not be on their own, even if the law mandates them to take part in this activity of controlling, or this mandate of controlling air pollution. They are provided some assistance by the DNR. Okay, if you look at the second paragraph, it says that DNR, that says the department, but of course they're referring to the DNR through EMB, shall provide the local government units with technical assistance, trainings, and a continuing capacity building program to prepare them to undertake full administration of the air quality management and regulation within their territorial jurisdiction. So they have a mandate to follow what's on the action plan and to implement, regulate all the pertinent activities that the law requires. So they have a mandate to do all of those things specific to their jurisdiction, but they're not on their own. They are given some assistance by the DNR. Okay, let's move forward. So some last words before we move on to the next topic. Since we were talking about the leaded gasoline and also the phasing out approach, that there's a timetable that is provided. I think it's also worthwhile mentioning that the law, the Clean Air Act, has provisions about quotas, emission quotas, as well as emission trading. Conceptually speaking, let me just provide a quick explanation, as easy as I can make it. Okay, when we're talking about quotas, emission quotas, those are cases. Well, actually, there are quotas that are set, obviously, and they're usually based on a given airshed area. So if you have let's say, for example, an area that has industries. So given the area that they're in, there's usually like a set standard on how much emission is allowed. So that standard, in essence, is the quota that we're referring to when we said emission quotas. Okay, so naturally that means industries are not supposed to go beyond that quota. Okay, but just to make it so they're not completely in a situation where they appear like bad guys. The way things have been put together, and this is not just in the Philippines, by the way. What the Philippines put together, itong quota and trading, is actually based on international standards. Okay, so so if you have industries in a given airshed, there's given a quota on the amount of emission that they're supposed to produce. If, say, for example, one of the industries is producing less than the quota, okay, let's just, for the sake of discussion, we're not going to get too technical here, but let's just say that the quota is at 100, okay, and one particular industry or manufacturing plant is producing much less than that. Again, these are just just for the sake of discussion, so we can make sense of it. Let's say that entity is producing much less than the quota. Let's say 80, because we said that the quota for this example is 100, but this entity is only producing emissions at 80. Okay, so that means they're under the quota, right? You have another entity that is producing more than 100, let's say 120. So they're technically, if you think about it, they're in violation. No, they're exceeding. Okay, what they can actually do is they can actually trade the entity that is under the quota could sell, uh, the amount, the difference between what he is actually emitting versus what the quota is. Let's call those credits. So he can actually sell those credits to the other entity who is in excess of the quota. So yun, that's kind of how it works. You know, they made it sort of into like a business, and the good news, of course, is that it gives people a solution, gives entities a solution when they're confronted with those cases, while at the same time, we're maintaining levels so that we're not continuing to, cause climate change, to increase that gaping hole in our atmosphere, because all of these standards are actually intended, to prevent those things, right? Um, and the good thing with this trading is that just because one entity is exceeding those standards, and he's able to trade with somebody who's not, it sort of balances out. Kasi whatever excess the entity incurs, whatever his overage is, okay, even if he's continuing to have those overages, for as long as he offsets by trading with someone who is, under the quota, okay, for the amount, the amount that entity is under quota is equivalent to the amount that the other person is over quota, go offset. So as long as there's that mechanism which this trading allows, then it balances out. Okay, so yun. So those are also features available on or at least features that are made available in this law. So now that can be done here in the Philippines. Okay, so let's move forward now. Let's go ahead and proceed to the next topic, which would be on punishable acts. So on punishable acts, the Clean Water Act presents things similarly to the last law that we discussed, the Laguna Lake Development Authority Act. Okay, it presents them unlike the earlier laws where you had a specific line item that already provides the elements of the offense, right? For this one, let me just quickly show you. It is actually referring to other sources, okay? So if we read this, let's focus in on subparagraphs A and B. So for subparagraph A, essentially what it's saying is that for violations of standards or limitations that are provided in this act itself, in this Clean Water Act itself, it's referring to those violations. So that, of course, means as an investigator who is trying to determine the elements of the offense, kailangan i-research mo muna sa batas na to. Specifically, you'd have to look at all of the standards that this law set and identify from those standards that it set which appears to be the standard that was violated in your case. Okay, and once you've determined that, then you home in on that specific provision to see what elements of the crime or of the unlawful act there is. Okay, so moving forward, the second item here, subparagraph B, refers to another source for those offenses, and this one it's referring to any order, rule, or regulation that is issued by the DNR with respect to such standard or limitation. So essentially, as it relates to these standards and limitations, if there are any issuances, namely an order, a rule, or a regulation that is issued by the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, then you'd have to refer to those issuances. They may maybe resolutions like LLDA in the LLDA, or generally kasi sa DNR, they're not resolutions, but rather they're Department Administrative Orders, so DAOs. Okay, so that's that's where you'll likely find those that fall under this subparagraph. Okay, now I did pull up just because I thought we would do some exercises under subparagraph A. But before we do that, let's just go over real quickly the first paragraph of section 40. It's entitled administrative action kasi anything, well, generally speaking anyway, the unlawful acts here are administrative cases. That of course means there is no jail time. It's usually a fine, okay, or some kind of a penalty involving payment of fees or something like those something to that effect, okay, but no jail time generally speaking. There are instances where criminal cases may be filed, but there are exceptions. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about the quasi-judicial body where these administrative cases are filed. Okay, so anyway, the first paragraph also just talks about who would be the persons that can initiate, that can institute these administrative cases, and all it's really saying is that it can be instituted by any person, okay, and or by the DNR themselves at their instance, or upon a complaint by another person, by any person. Okay, so that's all that says there. Okay, it just talks about who would essentially institute this administrative action. All right, so I hope that's clear. Let's move forward. Let's take a look at the examples under subparagraph A. So I pulled a couple of cases, or at least provisions, and two of them actually are very much related to the last thing that we were talking about leaded gasoline. So let's go ahead and pull that up real quick. So section 29, title is Prohibition on Manufacture, Import, and Sale of Leaded Gasoline and of engines and/or components requiring leaded gasoline. This is actually the same provision that we cited in the last topic. Okay, and let's just read it. We can skip through this effective not later than 18. I mean, essentially, it's effective now because this was really referring to the times shortly after this law was put into effect back in whenever that was in 1999. Okay, so these are already in effect. So the basically the act here. Well, let's start with the possible offender. So in reading it, it says that no person. Okay, so no person. So it's talking about any person. Okay, and the act really is that of manufacturing, importing, selling, offering for sale, introduce into commerce, convey or otherwise dispose of in any manner leaded gasoline and engines and components requiring the use of leaded gasoline. So there you have it. There is no qualifier. So if we put it on our worksheet, it looks like that. Okay, any person, and then act or omission is all of those things that followed: manufacture, import, sell, offer, etc., etc. Okay. The second one I also chose for this demonstration also speaks to leaded gasoline. Let's go ahead and look it up. Section 28. It's referring to, it's entitled misfueling. And it starts on the second half of the first sentence. It says, no person shall introduce or cause or allow the introduction of leaded gasoline into any motor vehicle equipped with a gasoline tank filter inlet and labeled quote-unquote unleaded gasoline only. This prohibition shall also apply to any person who knows or should know that such vehicle is designed solely for the use of unleaded gasoline. So, madali lang din ito. This is how it would look on our worksheet. Okay, possible offender is any person, and the act or omission is essentially everything else that I read after. No person shall. Okay, so it's introduce or cause or allow the introduction of leaded gasoline, and so on and so forth. So you should know this by now. Medyo siguro na master niyo na to. So the third thing I want to show, this one is a little bit more. It's a combination of more complicated, and but more conclusive, I would say. Okay, and this is a standard that's set in one of the provisions. Okay, it's talking about instances with respect to any trade, industry, process, and fuel burning equipment or industrial plant entitling air pollution, or sorry, emitting, not entitling, emitting air pollution, air pollutants. Okay, and basically these are the standards that it's talking about. It's talking about as it relates to particular pollutant, like the first column refers to the pollutant. So if you look at the first row of that first column, it's the first pollutant identified there is antimony and its compounds. Okay, so and it's talking about sources, and then the specific limit, the condition as to what is permissible, to what extent it is permissible, and then your method of analysis, in essence, how you concluded if what you are looking into actually complies with that standard. Okay, so this would imply that you would have the tools for this. So the good thing about that is the tools will tell you. It's a little bit more conclusive. Maybe you would just need to document your process just to make sure that if you're having to qualify how you collected or how you came up with that conclusion, you could talk about how you did it. So maybe there's that necessity of documenting it. But for the most part, if you're able to prove that you did collect that information correctly, okay, that you use the tool that's necessary to produce this analysis correctly, okay, basically it would just boil down to looking at the results that are produced by that tool, that equipment that you use, okay, and that in itself should technically be conclusive. I mean, they may challenge. There may be a challenge against how you use that tool. So again, as long as you're able to prove that you were you used it according to the instructions, that the machine is working, it's functioning properly, thus the results that it produces are accurate. Okay, so yun lang. So it's a little easier in that basta pinroduce na ng tool yan, the output, it's that's there it is, right? You probably wouldn't need to do any more investigation or anything like that. Okay, besides it's generally administrative cases naman so the standards are lower, so it wouldn't require, as an investigator, you wouldn't be doing anything heavier. But anyway, for these types of analysis, there's usually already facilities provided. Like for example, when it comes to cars, the emissions of cars, naturally there's emission centers, emission testing centers to determine, to essentially produce this analysis. Okay, so all right. So anyway, moving forward, at least this gives you examples of how the punishable acts are presented in the law, and of course, since they're administrative cases, the standards are lower. There's no jail time, generally speaking. It's just a fine or some type of citation with some penalty. So yun, that's kind of how this law presents those um, unlawful acts. Okay. Now I mentioned earlier the pollution, um, the pollution adjudication board. Okay. The pollution adjudication board is, because this is an administrative case, um, the body that you would be filing this case to, it wouldn't be the courts. It would be a not a judicial body, but a quasi judicial body, and that quasi judicial body is the PAB, the Pollution Adjudication Board. Okay, the PAB was actually created. You might recall in an earlier discussion that there's an executive order that was put into effect, which reorganized the DNR. So one of the things that it did in its reorganizing is it created this quasi-judicial body, the Pollution Adjudication Board, and of course its um, purpose is for the adjudication of pollution cases. Quasi-judicial body. Okay. Um, there's another instance where the PAB's jurisdiction was expanded, and in fact, the Clean Water Act, this specific act, there's a provision in there that expanded, well, actually, that made it. Okay, so the PAB is, sorry, this wasn't in the Clean Water Act. It's actually on the uh, under the revised rules and procedures. Okay, the revised rules and procedures. Um, that's the source as to what made it so the jurisdiction of the PAB uh, now covers also the Philippine Clean Air Act as well as the Clean Water Act, the same laws that we're talking about now. Okay, so yun. Anyway, so yun, this is where you would file the cases, and they're the ones that make the determination as to whether uh, you know there is indeed a violation or not. Okay, a finding of violation or not. Okay, so I think that is it. We are done with Clean Air Act, so we should now move to the Clean Water Act. All right, so now let's talk about the Clean Water Act. So what is this law all about? Okay, in essence, it is about protecting water bodies from pollution. So it's not too different from the Clean Air Act. Excuse me. The law also provides for a comprehensive water quality management, and of course, that's in its objective of protecting water bodies from pollution. Okay. Now, this comprehensive water quality management naturally provides a description of the requirements so that it can achieve its goal of protecting water bodies from pollution. So that's something that we will discuss when we look to answer how does it provide. But before we jump in to answer that, let's just dig a little deeper and get a little bit more information about what what is involved in protecting water bodies from pollution, and as well, the comprehensive water quality management. What else is involved with that, right? So let's take a look at a couple of slides that discuss that briefly. All right, so the first one is on the protecting water bodies from pollution. Okay, uh, this actually qualifies that the act of protecting, or that objective of protecting water bodies from pollution, is not, you know, um, it's not a complete sentence. Basically, there's a qualifier that the pollution that it is referring to here is that from land-based sources. Okay, kasi we're talking about pollution into water bodies, right? So uh, for this objective, when we talk about pollution, it is qualifying that that pollution is something that comes from sources not on the water but land based. Okay, So that's an important qualifier. Now, on the comprehensive water quality management, um, besides having that, uh, there is also an integrated strategy that aims to prevent and minimize pollution, which involves a multi-sectoral and participatory approach involving all the stakeholders. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the institutional mechanism that is provided by this law. All right. So, okay, so that gives us a little bit more depth about this, what this law is about protecting water bodies from pollution, and also a little bit about the comprehensive water quality management. Okay. But before we dive into, how this law provides, how it describes the requirements for this comprehensive water quality management, it would probably be a good idea to just quickly go over the provision of this law that talks about the coverage of this act. Okay, so I pulled this from the law itself, and basically it says that the coverage, okay, applies to water quality management in all water bodies. Okay, all water bodies throughout the country. Okay, so besides pollution from land-based sources, it is also talking as part of the scope. It's also talking about application, primarily the application um, of the abatement and control of that land-based pollution. Okay, so that's part of the coverage. Um, I think an important point of mention, also as it relates to penal provisions as well as civil liability, um, is that even if the source of the pollution is said to be land-based, okay, insofar as penal provisions and civil liability is concerned, it actually doesn't matter if the pollution does not come from land-based sources. Okay, that's what it says here. So, when it talks about a particular offense, when it talks about the elements of that offense, okay, we have to take into account that when it is referring to the body of water uh, as that having been polluted, the pollution, insofar as those penalties are concerned, or the definition of that offense is concerned, that pollution it's not necessary that it came from land-based sources. Okay, so essentially that's what this is saying here. All right, so I think that should give us enough to answer, hopefully more than enough to answer what this law is about. So let us now proceed on. So now let's talk about how this law provides. How does it provide such that it meets the objective of protecting water bodies from pollution? Okay, just a quick point. This is going to be a relatively quick um, discussion, only because everything that is on the Clean Water Act is not that different from the Clean Air Act in terms of the particular requirements the law has set in order to deliver on its objectives. Okay, so we'll just breeze through it and sort of identify what are possibly unique about them or things that are worthwhile mentioning. Okay, so with that, let us proceed. All right, so like the Clean Air Act, it is also comprising of a water quality management system. Of course, the Clean Air Act was an air quality management system. So it's a system that is also based on a number of similar things, or actually almost identical things to that in the Clean Air Act. Okay, but first of all, let's take a look at some of the bullet points that are worthwhile mentioning about the water quality management system. Okay, so first, it refers to a management areas. It's talking about management areas. Okay, when really this is the scope of this water quality management system. Management areas that are designated as such. Yeah, we're talking about water quality management areas, which are designated as such, and it's not just one that's designated in the Philippines. There are, a number of them, and their designation is based on, common factors in that given area. Usually, something that's based on a watershed, and of course, in the case of clean area, would have been, in this case, it may also play in, and I'm talking about airsheds, of course. Okay, so multiple designated water quality management areas. Okay, so let's see if there's anything. Let me just quickly look at my notes to see if there's anything in there I have to mention. Okay, I already said that they share common characteristics. Okay, like geographic conditions, that sort of thing. All right, and they may also share common interests or phase, and basically things that would make it so development programs, and even problems are the same for that water quality management area. Okay, so they're just groupings. Okay, so with these management areas, there is a governing body. Okay, there is one for each of these management areas, water quality management areas. Okay, and they are composed of a number of key players in government. Okay, and even NGOs as well as people's organizations. So you have, for example, representatives from the local executives, the mayors of cities or municipalities, or governors of provinces, including local government, the smaller local government units, meaning the barangay captains. That's what those sorts of representatives. Okay. I mentioned there's also participation of non-government organizations, the NGOs. Okay. As well as concerned water utility sector and business sector. So they are not necessarily part of the government, but they are, because of their focus area, the fact that they're in this sector, they are also an important participant, an important player in these governing boards. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, the other things worth mentioning about this water quality management system is that it also covers national programs on sewerage and septage management. So that's, the sewage system and the septic tank, the septic systems, those things are also covered under this water quality management system. Okay. All right. So the other things worthwhile mentioning is that it regulates wastewater discharges. Okay. So this is when there is something that needs to be discharged, and generally because they're fluids, it probably makes sense to, or at least maybe convenient or whatever reason, but there is a need to discharge them into the body of water, a body of water that this law protects from pollution. Okay, so naturally there's certain conditions that have to be met, certain qualities, I suppose, in order for discharges to be allowed, and in order to be able to determine if what is proposed to be discharged meets those conditions, there must naturally be a process of regulating it, and that process involves obtaining permits. The more common well, they're called discharge permits. Okay, so that's one way that describes exactly how it's regulated. Okay, and like the other permits that we've discussed before, these permits are undertakings, agreements really, um, that makes it so the permittee understands exactly what his obligations are, what the limits of his licenses are, what the terms are of his license or permit, and that he undertakes to abide by those terms and conditions. Okay, because that is what the permit permits. Okay, so he has to remain within the confines of the permit. All right, so that is regulate wastewater discharges. Okay, there is also coverage for effluent trading per management area. And this trading is almost the same. Actually, it's technically the same, but they're not talking about the same exact thing that's to be traded. It's just, and I'm referring to the emission trading that we talked about when we were talking about the Clean Air Act. You might recall my last points that the Clean Air Act provided for that. There's quotas, and that if there are people that are not meeting those emission quotas, they are essentially under the quota, so they have credits that they can sell to others who are, who have exceeded those quotas. So same thing here, but instead of emissions, of course, we're talking about affluent trading here. Okay, so, and it's per management area. Okay, that's, I think, one key point to mention here. Okay, let's see. Let's move on. Okay, there is also a reward system, which is a nice thing, I suppose. It's a good way to empower, so it's not always, the government's not always looking like a, tough body that imposes all of these limitations. So, it deviates from that persona, so to speak, to being more of a positive body by giving rewards. Okay, and the kind of rewards that it gives, are those whose wastewater discharges is better than the water quality criteria of the receiving body of water. So, in other words, if the body of water where the discharges are going to be sent to, where the water is going to be discharged to, if the water that will be discharged has a better quality than the body of water that's receiving that water, then that is warranting, or it warrants a reward for whoever it is that is looking to discharge that water. Okay, let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, so let's now proceed on and talk about the institutional mechanism. Okay, this is very similar to the Clean Air Act. I think I've mentioned that more than once already. It's also not too different insofar as the institutional mechanism. First, the law discusses who is the lead agency um, to take responsibility for implementing and enforcing this law. And we know that to be the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Okay, and this body, this government agency, as the lead agency, has a number of powers and functions. But I wanted to home in on three that were consistent with some of the very important objectives or very important requirements or means of meeting objectives of the Clean Air Act. And that's basically the action plan, the official blueprint, as I mentioned. It's the same here. There is also an action plan that is put together. It's a 10-year water quality management area action plan, and DNR is tasked to ensure that that is produced. but of course it doesn't do it on its own. It is this action plan is something that comes as an output or as a something that's based on the integrated framework, the integrated water quality management framework. Okay, again, this is also the same thing that exists in the Clean Air Act, and it's no different here in the Clean Water Act. It's something that is created and something that provides the basis for the action plan, the 10-year action plan. Okay. The integrated water quality management framework is also something that didn't just get created out of nowhere. It has its basis, and like the Clean Air Act, it is based on findings from status reports that the DNR prepares. Okay, the National Water Quality Status reports that it does on a regular basis. Okay, so let's move on. Other things about the other points under institutional mechanism. Okay, so besides the DNR, the local government also plays in. They have a role in this whole objective of protecting water bodies from pollution. Okay, they share responsibilities in managing and improving this system or the conditions, and of course this as it pertains to their area of jurisdiction. Okay, so that's their focus area. So naturally, if we're talking about a province, it would be the governor that has that responsibility, and if we're talking about a city or municipality, it would be the mayor. And likewise, the smaller units, the barangays, also play in. Okay, so let's see what else we have here. Linkages. So besides the DNR and local government, in order to fulfill the multi-sectoral body, to have this multi-sectoral body boards, there is naturally a need to involve as many in the sector as possible, not just government entities, but non-government entities as well. So in these linkages, it's not just about making contacts or anything like that, but it aims for agreements between them, since they do share in in the responsibility. They do play a role somehow in protecting the water bodies. So it only makes sense that besides linkages, that they come up with sort of agreements that would harmonize their efforts and ensure that the objective of protecting water bodies from pollution is achieved. Okay, so besides government agencies, we're talking about industrial sector as well as other concerned sectors, and of course the purpose is so that the objectives of this act could be furthered along. Okay, it's for the furtherance of the objectives of this law. Okay. So let's go ahead and proceed to acts that are punishable. In other words, the punishable acts that are provided in this law, the Clean Water Act of 2004. All right, so let's go ahead and pull them up. I think what you're going to discover when you look at this law is that it's going to be pretty much reverting back. In other words, the way it's presented here is the same as the earlier laws that we were looking at. If you remember the earlier laws, medyo madali, because they pretty much gave you all of the definitions, all of the details that you need. Everything is there. Answers to question number 1 as to who the offender is. Number 2, which asks what is the act or omission, and if that act or omission is not by itself a crime, then we go to question 3 of asking what makes it a crime. Okay, so all of those 3 have been present in the earlier laws, and as we proceeded along, they kind of changed a little bit. They became a little tricky to determine, and even the sources as to where to find these provisions, they started disappearing from the law itself, and rather they started to defer to other sources. Uh, so in a way, the Clean Air Act was precisely that way. The specific section did not give or enumerate each and every one of the offenses, and it did not give, obviously, since it did not give uh, that enumeration, it didn't provide any definitions. You would have to go elsewhere to find those. So anyway, for this one, it's back to easy mode because it's presented in this one section, section 27. But there is just a very, very slight twist. It doesn't give you the answer to the first question that we're asking to determine the elements. But I think that we can pretty much already conclude as to who the possible offender would be, and essentially that would be any person. So, having said that, the rest of what is written on each one of these subparagraphs are the acts themselves, and on occasion, when there is one, naturally it would also provide the qualifier that would make the act an offense or an unlawful act. Okay, so with that said, I would suggest you do the same thing that I've been asking you to do, which is to do your own exercises. Look at each and every one of the prohibited acts and see if you could, on your own, like you've been doing, determine if you can extract the elements, okay, of the offense. All right, but what we'll do is we'll continue to at least two exercises just to stay in the spirit of doing this exercise. We've been doing it for all of the laws thus far, except for Clean Air Act because of the special circumstance. But nonetheless, we're gonna still we're gonna do it for the Clean Water Act. We're gonna at least for two, and then the rest, since there's quite a bit of them, I'm gonna leave them to you to play with on your own. Okay, so that said, let's take a look. Let's go ahead and focus on the first one, subparagraph A, which talks about discharging, depositing, or causing to be deposited. Now, if you read that, it would not be immediately obvious to you that there's a qualifier, okay? Because, as in the past, the qualifiers have been, actually, no, what? This one doesn't have a qualifier. I'm talking about the second one. I apologize. This one is really easy because pretty much the entire paragraph is the act itself. So there's nothing more you need to do but just to understand it. So you know exactly how to determine or look for the facts that tell you that indeed the elements coincide based on the facts. Okay. So for this one, this is dead easy. Okay. So offender is any person, and the actor or omission is pretty much the entire subparagraph itself. Okay. So very, very easy. Let's proceed to the second one. This is the one I was talking about that's a little tricky because if you read it, it doesn't sound like it has a qualifier, but it does. And I'm referring to subparagraph D. It says disposal of potentially infectious medical waste into seawater by vessels unless the health or safety of individuals on board the vessel is threatened by a great and imminent peril. So if you read it too fast, it may not immediately catch on to it, the qualifier. But you have to just sort of read it carefully and try to make sense of it word for word, and you'll be able to determine that there is one. Okay. What makes it tricky is the act itself. The way it's presented is that it's, as a general rule, it's unlawful. That's kind of how it is presented. That's the message that it's saying. It's a general rule that disposing of potentially infectious medical waste into seawater by vessel is unlawful. That's a general rule. Unless, here's the qualifier, see, unless the health or safety of individuals on board the vessel is threatened by a great and imminent peril. Okay? So, the qualifier here is not part of the general rule, because it's starting with the word unless. Unlike the earlier ones that we worked with, where it says doing this, 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 and this without a permit. Okay, that's pretty clear that it becomes because that doing this, 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 and that by itself is not unlawful, but when you do it without a permit, then it's unlawful. But here it's sort of the other way around, because it's saying it's unlawful except or unless, that's kind of how it's phrased. All right. So that said, this is how it would look on our table, okay, on our worksheet. Okay, so the offender is any person. The act or omission would be disposal of potentially infectious medical waste into seawater by vessels. And the qualifier, of course, the general rule is it's unlawful to do that, but the qualifier is that the health or safety of individuals on board the vessel are not threatened by a great and imminent peril. Okay, so in other words, if their health or if the health or safety of the individuals are threatened, then it would not be unlawful. Okay, in other words, like I said, general rule, it's unlawful, and it becomes not unlawful. It becomes lawful, in other words, when there are individuals on board whose health and safety are threatened by a great and imminent peril. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Medyo confusing siya, but just read it slowly and carefully, and it will make sense. But just think in those terms. It's presented as a general rule. It's unlawful unless, parang ganyan. Okay. So anyway, so that said, I'm going to leave you with the rest of the prohibited acts for you to practice on. Hopefully you're doing that. I'm sure you are, and we've done quite a number of laws. So surely by now you are pretty versed in figuring out the elements of the offense. So anyway, I think at this point we're done with lesson 1. Yes, we are done with lesson 1. So having said that, I will now bid you goodbye for now, and talk to you again in lesson number 2.